Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all here on such a beautiful day. I had proposed earlier on that we could maybe move the event outside into the sunshine, but unfortunately, with all the technology and all the Wi-Fi and all the wires, we thought that might not work. So unfortunately, we'll have to stay inside, but bring some of the sunshine with us in terms of our discussions and our attitudes. My name is William Kilbride, and I am the director of this shadowy little organisation called the Digital Preservation Coalition, and it's my privilege and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to the fourth in this series of workshops organised by the DPC, but really on behalf of JISC and a major programme from JISC called the Research Data Shared Service, which we're going to hear quite a lot about today. And I'm not going to introduce particularly at this point. Let me give you a couple of bits and pieces of housekeeping, though, before we start. Those of you looking for it, and I think in order of importance here, there is Wi-Fi available, and the username, the password, and the account name is there on the screen. Secondly, I know a lot of you are on Twitter, so please do use the hashtag to connect to people who are listening in from outside. People listening in from outside reminds me to say that we are doing a sort of combination of webcast and recording for today's event. So there's cameras here and here. The microphones provide amplification in the room, but they're also our way of feeding to the community outside. So if it comes to moments of discussion or question, please, if you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone to get to you and to use the microphone, even though it doesn't feel like you need it in what's quite an informal setting today. And of course, if you don't want to participate in the video feed, well, the obvious thing to say is, the cameras are positioned where they are, but if you want specifically to be excluded from the shots, then let Sarah at the back know who's running the mixing desk and all. And then finally, if you're wanting to share the event later or segments of the event, presentations and so forth that you've seen today, then the recording will be online afterwards, and we'll share that recording with DPC members. So if you want to grab a copy of that, you're welcome also. Also, in terms of logistics for the day, you've probably found it already, but the coffee pot is there. I think you've got a better view of the coffee pot than I. You can actually see it. We could get live reporting from the coffee pot from this table. We have the toilets gents' toilets on this floor, ladies' toilets up a flight of stairs. And I feel at this point now I should ask if everyone is in the right room and is everyone here for the same seminar on future-proofing research data. If you're in the right room, say yes, William. Okay, last chance to leave. Let me take a look then at the programme for today. The first thing to say before I dive into the programme, the first thing to say is it looks like a very formal programme. And there is a formal agenda, and that will sort of propel us through the day and get us to the various conclusions we want to draw. But it occurs to me that sticking rigidly to the formality of the programme won't necessarily deliver to us the outcomes that we want from today. So although there's a formal programme, if we deviate from that formal programme with everyone's permission, I'm sure that we'll actually benefit from that to a greater or lesser extent. So formal looking, but hopefully an informal feel to the day. Because let's not kid ourselves, the purpose of today isn't to receive a series of presentations. The object of today is to participate in a set of discussions, to learn from those discussions and from the presenters who are going to share their ideas and their thoughts and their experiences with us. But also, if you're able to bring your experience and your thoughts and your expertise to bear, then the reality is this thing called the Research Data Shared Service will in the long run be a better service. And really, that's what we're here for today, to learn and to listen, the DPC acting as, if you like, moderator for those discussions and trying to feed some of your needs and your requirements back to JISC, who will present some work, but it's a bit of a template or a bit of an open kind of chalkboard. We can draw things still on that template. We can add things as our requirements develop. So, first to run through the program then. So you've got a series of presentations in the morning, and in a moment or two I'm going to hand over to Chris Keane from JISC, who's going to, I guess, get a crystal ball out a little bit and gaze into the future for us and think about the coming challenges of research data management. And there'll be time for Q&A after that. We're going to then move on to a series of case studies, and there's three. I hope you'll find them really interesting case studies, been quite carefully selected case studies. First from Emma Hewitt at the Royal College of Music, then from Mark Hibbett at the University of the Arts. Mark, are you here? I'm not sure we've met. Mark, hello, how do you do? And then finally Simon, where are you? There we are, from the UK Data Service. It's three case studies, so there's one in the arts, one in music, one in, I guess, social science data, economic data. And we've picked those because they seem, so that's not the whole of the academy, do you know? We haven't put in, I don't know, medical research or engineering or different, you could try and cover every discipline. What we tried to do is to select, if you like, genres of data. Okay, or data with specific characteristics. And I hope this works, okay? So we have, in music, I'm going to expect a bit about time-based media. In the social sciences, I'm going to expect kind of issues to do, for example, will emerge, I'm guessing, around sort of the highly curated data sets that require, for example, data protection regulations and privacy issues to arise. In the arts example, again, I'm making presumptions here, but it seems to me that the digital creativity, especially in the creative arts, is really at the cutting edge of a lot of digital creativity. So we're going to probably bring in things here about the gap that's closing between application and data, between software and installation, as well as data sets. So these are complex, different examples, okay? And I need you to think and pay attention to the examples. Because afterwards, after lunch, we're going to break into three groups. And I want you to think of which of those characteristics of data kind of matches more closely to your own workspace or your own expectations of what data will be like in your discipline. And then we're going to do a workshop session, a breakout session for an hour or so with a set of questions into one or other of those three themes. After that, and lots of tea and coffee and lunch and everything in between, we will then hear more about the Research Data Shared Service from Paul, and a bit of an open discussion then about what you've learned in the workshops and what we therefore need to add to the proposition from the Research Data Shared Service. Okay? That's our plan for today. Everyone happy with that? Everyone still want to stay at this workshop today? There's a note of a panel discussion. My guess is that will be hopefully, if it goes well, actually a bit of a free-for-all where we bring thoughts to the fore, but it doesn't have to be very formal. We share them, and we've set the room out in what's the phrase they use? Cabaret style, or is it banquet style? I love the analogy anyway, that this is more like a cabaret than a workshop. So presumably I'll come in, I don't know, inside a cake later on or something like that, something exciting. We're due to finish at 4:15. It seems to me if we run on beyond that, that's no bad thing, particularly if we end before that, that's also no bad thing. We open a discussion today, and we can continue that discussion by other means if we need to. But of course, we have to respect people's trains and commitments and other things that people need to get to. Finally then, to say about where we are in this process. So, this is the last of 4 workshops. The DPC, on behalf of JISC, has been doing a bit of community consultation, I think you would call it, around the Research Data Shared Service, asking a variety of stakeholders in a variety of different ways and in different venues deliberately to contribute to their thinking around what their requirements are in terms of managing research data for the long term. We began in York I don't know, it feels like it was in the 1950s, a long time ago in any case, with people who are actively involved already with the GIST Research Data Shared Service. We had a workshop in Glasgow in January. We had a very large workshop in London in March, which was massively oversubscribed, but it was very successful. And then we have the final one today. And on each of those occasions, we've been asking just subtly different questions as we go. And having asked what the Research Data Shared Service offers to those already engaged with this programme, we asked what the Research Data Shared Service means for other types of university or higher education stakeholder. So is there something there for archives? Is there something there for special collections within a university? In the third workshop, we asked, what does this mean for the wider community? Does this have implications for local government services? Does this have implications for the other types of people who might be interested in digital preservation services on some sort of basis or some sort of relationship with a higher education institution? And in the final workshop today, we kind of move to another, if you like, set of stakeholders entirely, a very difficult set of stakeholders to think about. That's ourselves in 5 years' time. So what will our needs be for the future? And so I need you all to think of yourselves 5 years from now. You've got that big job, you've lost a bit of weight, you've got to the gym more often, and you're feeling great about your newly promoted role, and what aspirations, what are the things that are making you happy in your work, and what are the things that might be keeping you back. So that's what we're about today. I'm going to pause, as always, and ask if there's any questions. Everyone happy with that? I think the coffee pot's still there. Is it still there? Oh, it's empty. Well, we'll see if we can organise some more shortly. Shall we keep going? So, Chris, are you ready? Ready as you'll ever be?
We'll go for that.
We're going to hand on now to Chris. Let me just give properly the title of your presentation rather than just guessing at it. The future for research data management. Man alive, that's a challenge. The future of research data management from Chris Keane and the Scholarly Futures Group at JISC. Thank you very much, Chris, for doing this, and thank you for setting up the discussion today. And I feel we should observe at the start, you know, that Chris is sharing his ideas and his thoughts with us, and it's brave to do that in a kind of future-looking world. So thank you very much for doing that, Chris.
I wasn't worried until you said that. So, well, thank you, William, and welcome. I'm really excited about today, and I think that discussion later on in the afternoon should be really useful for us. My name's Chris Keane. I'm head of library and scholarly futures at JISC. So I work with the research data team and the scholarly communications teams and others across JISC who are doing work in this area. I'm going to talk today around where I think the world of research data in particular may be going in the future, let's say sort of 5 years' time or so. What will be the needs of researchers? What might they be wanting to do? How we might be helping them? But to help with that discussion, I will be saying where we are now briefly, and I'll talk a bit about the Research Data Shared Service just so we all know what it is, because sometimes people talk about it or people may not have heard about it so much. Right, so this is perhaps a bit of a personal reflection of how we got to where we are, because so open access came along, and that's probably the biggest disruptor of the scholarly communication and research environment there's been in recent times, probably much more so than just the move to online. And certainly for me, everyone was talking about open access and repositories and getting research out there, making it freely available, especially articles. And this thing, data, it was kind of this almost a sideshow. You know, we sometimes people talk about it. Sometimes we'd like the idea of making it openly available, but it really wasn't the most important thing. It was somewhat people come along with a file and you think, okay, we can put it in a repository, great, fine. But it was nice. Didn't see it's that important even. It was just a nice little thing to do. But the big thing we all talked about was open access. And I think gradually around that time, there was, outside of academia, there was sort of this drive for opening things up. You know, and there was an open data initiative and so forth. So there was a push to make data openly available. And I think at the same time, if I remember that around the same time, there was that real kind of ramping up of the need for research data management plans and that whole research data management, which you could say was kind of a parallel thing. It wasn't quite the same as making it openly available, but it was all around the idea of people thinking around their data more and what they do with it, how they manage it, and how they make access to it. So I'm moving on quite a few years here, so I guess like sort of 6, 7, 8 years later. I think discussion moved on a bit. The nuanced, we discovered that open data is different to open access for research articles. That has a whole different bunch of challenges, of issues, of concerns that making an article freely available didn't really have. It had its own issues, but that was a separate thing. And those issues were around ethics and privacy and people's personal information and academics' concern around not wanting to release what data before they've had a chance to publish their results from that data, or worried that that data may open them up to being criticised about the quality of their research or people scrutinising what they do. So there's a whole bag of concerns around this opening up. And I think my understanding, my way of describing it, is that is partly what led to the FAIR principles, which now come up all the time. It's a way of saying, okay, what do we want by open? Why do we want this open data? And actually, it's to be able to access it. It's to be able to find it. It's to be able to use it and interoperate with it. It doesn't necessarily have to always be open. It doesn't have to be this kind of one-click download from a repository, but it needs to meet these requirements. These on the right were just refined by Force 11 just after that article got published. So research data has, I think we all know, we're all here today, we've been for the last few years, has been increasingly becoming this I would say like equal player alongside open access around this important disruptor, transforming what researchers are doing and perhaps what people like libraries are having to respond to that. And certainly within GISC, we often refer to this kind of burning platform, this idea we can't just sit there and do nothing because there are concerns and issues around compliance and funder compliance, legal compliance, risks of sensitive information being released, but requiring us to really firm up how we manage data and how we can make that available as needed. So there's a whole bunch of issues and funder mandates which we collectively need to address. Who knows what the who would be familiar describing what the Research Data Shared Service is from GISC, apart from Paul? Okay, that's great. That means I'm not boring you when I try to describe it. I'm not actually technically in the same team who are having to work flat out to work on it, which is great for me, but it also means that I get to sort of describe it in my own way, and I'll just try and describe it in a fairly high level, briefly. So this came around, GISC ran a consultation with universities around 2015, looking at what challenges we felt we should be working on. And a number of things came out of that around learner analytics, digital capability, but one of the big ones was research data. So we then refined that again with the community, and a bunch of work came out of that, and the biggest piece by far was this idea of research data shared service. So what is such a thing? Well, it's set of components, I guess modules, the key ones being broadly what you might think of as a repository and preservation modules, but I think it's much more than that. And I'd broadly describe it as that kind of, without using that awful analogy of always going back to a motor car, it's the thing you can get in and drive away with, rather than a bunch of components you need to work out how you connect together and set up to work in the right way and work out how you want to make it work for yourself. We've been spending a lot of time, people have been spending a lot of time working out how this system and these components need to work together, how they share data and metadata between each other, what the flows of data need to be, and how they work with the wider systems, both institutionally and globally and nationally. So those other sort of national compliance systems and international systems like open air, etc., how we can work with those systems to really out and identifiers as well, work seamlessly, almost out of the box. So it should be sort of thing you can out of the box and you can just get going, rather than, and I know for certain systems you need to configure them quite a lot to get going. So yes, it has the key areas, which again you can think of, some of which would fit into a traditional repository system, are about depositing, making it available, but then preserving it and being able to report on it and connecting it in with other key requirements. I'm not going to dwell too much on that. But I think the key thing is this this hides a whole bunch of complexity around that way that these different parts into communicate and connect with each other. And we haven't built this from scratch. These different components are actually existing bits of software. And one of the key requirements was, when we were talking to people, which made it really difficult actually, was people said, well, we might have different, some of us want open source software, some of us don't like open source software, some of us have already got bits and pieces already, we don't want to replace what we've already got. So we had this quite difficult requirements that it had to work with different pieces of software, some of which we went out to an open tender, and these are the ones which we're working with. But in it allows in the future other preservation systems, other repositories, etc., to come in and connect in. And if someone already has a repository and that is already been set up to work with the RDSS, Research Data Shared Service, that can be used instead. That's fine. So yeah, this slide is saying that if, like say, if you've already got a particular system, then we can fill the gaps around it, and it will fit into that kind of communication system. I've put this slide in just to show some of the areas where we're working with. So this is another JISC initiative called the Tiered Storage Service, which Paul may mention a bit later on. I don't even understand this diagram fully, but essentially the RDSS, which you can kind of see is one of the primary example up there, this is one of the options to enable what it will think is a file being stored into a file system is actually being stored in many places, and where it's stored is intelligently decided on based on how the needs of access, the needs of the size and the long-term preservation requirements, whether it goes to a tape or disk, etc. So it's these kind of interconnections. I thought that's a good example of something we're working on. And finally, I wanted just to mention that we're coming up to sort of launching it later this year fully, but there's a plan is to move that beyond research data. I mean, you can get, I'm trying not to get bogged down into that defining what research data is and what the data is, but of course, you could say articles are data, you know, and certainly cultural objects are data and so forth. So how we can broaden this out to really make this a system which caters for everyone's digital object repository needs, including research articles and all the things related around that, around embargoes and ref compliance, etc. Is something we're looking at how we can adapt that for the future. Again, on this slide, you can see that there's a whole bunch of things we're working with on that. So at the end, you can ask me, and Paul will talk much more in detail later on around this, but this is just a broad overview of what it's trying to do. It's there's some great systems out there. We mentioned some earlier. Big for example, I love the user interface. It's great if you want to upload a file and download it. That's fantastic. But this tries to extend that to really capture those needs we identified at the beginning in one solution. So that's research data shared service. One of the things which my job title has the word futures in it, what means I have to think about the future sometimes, which means reading lots of information. Where are we going? What are researchers doing in the future which will affect what we need to think about in terms of research data? And I think this is quite interesting because, certainly as I alluded to earlier, it's very easy when you're in your sort of day-to-day job, and I find the same. You're thinking about those files, you're thinking about data management plans or so forth, or the metadata for some sort of particular thing, and getting bogged down in those details. And I think we forget just how dominant this will be in the future in really shaping how research changes in the future. It's hard to think of a discipline where this is not going to help shape or create more potential and advantages in the future by them using data, reusing data, and finding new tools and technologies to really drive new discoveries, etc. And when I talk to people I know who are sort of in various fields in research, it strikes me how much in every area, ultimately, they're research is around using evidence and needing evidence to create your research. Most of the time, that evidence will be data, maybe primary sources in some areas, but mainly data. So I think my overall message is we should feel positive that what we're doing here is going to have a massive impact in academia in the future, but that in itself will create challenges for us, because the more impact, the more essential you become, the more requirements and difficulties we're going to face. So, as I alluded to, the data, you can find 1,000 definitions of data, but data is not just those traditional data sets, but it is those research articles. It is the code what people use for their science. It's their science notebooks and logbooks. It's the algorithms and methods they're using to implement those things. So there's a whole broad range of different kinds of research objects which people are using, which we can class as data and can be stored as data. And if we collect them together and we can intelligently link them together around a particular piece of research, there's a huge number of potentials there around how people can then take those collectively and reuse those in the future. So I just wanted to perhaps talk about some ideas of what researchers in the future may be doing with research data, which we may need to think about. So the first one, perhaps the most obvious, perhaps the most near term, is data mining. So there's text and data mining, but we're going to talk about particular data mining. This seems to be here and now, developing rapidly. It has a whole bunch of issues around how people can access the right data they want to in the correct way, in a way that allows them to access it in different systems in a consistent manner, how they can comply with licenses in different international contexts, and finding the right and getting the right skills and staff in to help perform this. But from our perspective, a lot of that data will be in data repositories, which we may be involved in and helping to run. How would they, if they wanted, if this researcher here wanted to access to data mine across all our repositories automatically for a particular piece of research, how would they do that? What would the issues be? But the potential for that, for people to have to go away and say, I'm looking for data around this, maybe just to find it so they can collect it together, maybe to query it like it was some ginormous SQL database or advanced search, if you like. There's different uses of data mining what are currently being used. I mentioned finding, there's also categorization and semantics, etc. But being able to access, they need to understand what that data looks like. They need to understand what that data set is, or the machine, the code they're using needs to be able to do that. So it needs to be machine readable, machine understandable. So there's quite a few issues there, I think, and questions around how the environment they would need in the future around metadata and understanding and description, which enable them to access that across a distributed environment. Sticking with data mining, I first put in this quite specific one, I thought, because this is quite, so someone decides they want to use sound recordings. They want to find out that maybe in the social sciences, they want to go around globally to find out different views around the world, different languages that need to be translated on the fly, and then the text understood semantically, so they can then collect and summarize. Maybe they're not summarizing it. Maybe the computer is summarizing for them the conclusions when they look around, when the coding and the bot goes around and looks at those different repositories. And then perhaps the biggest one, perhaps more slightly a few years away, is this idea of bots, if you like, well, there's crawlers and code set up, which will go around and look at data sets combined in perhaps a particular field, and often chemistry is mentioned here, to help pick up those common threads, those themes, which we as humans don't spot. There's articles and there's data sets out there. What if a particular, my chemistry is awful, but yeah, a particular chemical or element in a set of experiments is having a very slight effect, but no one's spotting that in various different fields of chemistry, but something can go across and pick up that pattern and spot new characteristics, new conclusions and discoveries, which we weren't even particularly looking for, but they can go through those data sets and find. And that could apply to many different fields and disciplines. And being able to set something off and say, find me something what's already in the data out there, but we as humans haven't spotted that yet, is a huge, massive potential. So, very large data, not big data. I think we often work on the idea at the moment that people want to just download the data and do something with it. What if people don't want to download that data? And this probably follows on from this previous one as well. What if they just want to query that data where it is? They can't download 20 petabytes of whatever. They need to be able to query that from different sources using some standard tool, some standard language, and come back with the results. Is that something we can facilitate? That sounds like a really obvious thing to do. It seems silly to have to download something to run a quick query. This is quite a popular one. You may have come across this before. And I alluded to this a few minutes ago. People are talking about trust in science, trust in scholarship. How can we reproduce the results of research, what's taking place? Well, if you have the data, you have the code, you have the method and the algorithms, and you can pull those together. Ideally, without having to do that by hand, if some system can understand those things are what they are and how they are part of the same experiment, you can reproduce that piece of research. Clearly, this won't apply to every piece of research. If the research required someone in a lab pouring some chemical into a jar, etc. But if it's based on the data, you should be able to reproduce it and maybe do that en masse to help verify and ensure that the results being published And we know that in today, that articles being published, people are unable to recreate the results, and some massive studies have been found that years later they've been questioned because no one's able to validate what's been said. But to follow on from that, being able to take those components and say, great, but now I want to change those inputs. You did this with these values. I want to do this with a different country, with a different set of data, and do a different kind of piece of research. Again, suddenly reducing the barrier to conducting a piece of research, rather than having to set that all up, work out how you're going to do that, working out the tools, the methods, requirements, being able to very quickly just grab a package and change some parameters and rerun it, could really reduce the overheads in running an experiment. And I should note out there, one of those data sources I've put is virtual machines. So the idea that one way of preserving, and some people here will be very familiar in this, one way of preserving the ability to run a piece of research in the future is to grab a virtual machine exactly of all that, where that code and that software was, because trying, as we know, to download a piece of software 10 years later, you tend to find that it no longer runs. If everyone's had to download a old MS-DOS or something like that, a Windows 95 piece of software, and you find it won't run, or even on an iPhone, something from 2 years ago, be able to grab a virtual machine of that entire environment, which you can then reinitiate years later with all the things there to run, is one way to ensure that that experiment can be run again in the future. But to do these things, we need links again between those data sources, and we need, which may be in different places, and this idea of creating packages around these data. This one's a bit more vague, and in some ways you can say, well, we're already doing this, but people are working in a distributed environment, and academics have always worked internationally and worked beyond boundaries, but we're finding that the potential for someone to be using a piece of equipment of any description in one place and a massive data storage in one or many other places, and computing power somewhere else, while the researchers may be in many other different places, is increasing, and the requirements around that are getting sometimes more nuanced around the different laws, the different requirements, the technical requirements of these things working seamlessly together. Now, how much you could say would this affect research repositories or in our world? That's a question. But there are initiatives around the European Open Science Cloud and similar, which are trying to create a new, they won't call it a framework, they're still defining it at the moment, but trying to define a way which people can work seamlessly. Research can be borderless in the same way as the European Union's desire for other aspects, people and trade, etc., to be borderless. So how will that affect data and how we store it? So my sort of question is that if we stayed still today, if we kept the same repositories today, if we kept the same systems and support we have today in place, how well would they be able to do the things we just described? How would people be able to recognize what piece of data is what, and be able to use it in such a way that we were referring to earlier? Because I got a feeling that some of those would struggle to meet those requirements. So how can we? What should we be doing? Maybe there's some things we should say, that's not our game, that's for someone else to do. But what can we collectively, in whatever role we're in, think about how institutional systems, national systems, maybe even international systems, so they're quite hard to do, can help deliver some of these things, or deliver the foundations, the infrastructure, so that researchers can do these sort of things and research more effectively. So earlier on, I talked about a burning bridge of now, the issues we need to think about now, which are driving us to be here today and think about things. But what's the burning bridge of 5 years' time? And I think it is that idea that if we stay as we are, people will have to find workarounds and other places, maybe not such ideal places, maybe more commercial or those with perhaps dodgy business cases, to enable them to do some of the things we described today. If we want people to use places where we know the data will be well looked after and preserved and managed in an institution, for example, we're going to need to make sure our systems are up for helping to really, and our support services are up to really help support the research of tomorrow, some of which I've tried to think about and describe this now. So my end note is just, people often talk about the scholarly record, how we can preserve the scholarly record. Well, the scholarly record to me seems to be tomorrow all around data. Data, and again, you can include articles in that as you wish, and books and monographs and so forth, but data being produced rather than just the end output of a publication is the key component which is going to really drive and be the record of scholarly outputs in the future, of scholarly work in the future. So I think that should be a positive note. We should be thinking about what we're doing here is quite exciting, but that's quite a challenge as well. So I'd love if you've got any thoughts or questions or challenges to that, and I'll be happy for any questions.
Thank you very much, Chris. We've got about 5-10 minutes worth of time for some questions before we move on to the next stage. So I see Paul Stokes here from JISC has the first question. Which reminds me to say, when you're asking a question, would you mind saying who you are and where you're from? I know it's a bit formal, but it promotes discussion later. So Paul Stokes from JISC.
Right. It's more a couple of observations of the burning bridges of the future. And those who know me will not be surprised that one of the first things I'm going to mention is money, sustainability. That's the biggest burning bridge I think we're going to come across, is how to pay for all this. Because there's ever-increasing amounts of data, and trying to make the case, and there are colleagues in the room who are also trying to make the case and working on this as well, it's difficult because the powers that be don't get it. And the other observation is that wearing my geek credentials on my sleeve, we're running out of space. There isn't enough space to put this stuff. We're running out of the rate in which we produce storage media is reportedly, anecdotally, less than the rate in which we're producing data. We have to start throwing things away, and there are other various people in the room as well. Neil over there who are looking at things like that. So those are the two big ones for me.
That's an easy question. I agree.
A show of hands in the room, has there ever been a time when you've had enough money in the future? Does anyone want to report a time when they felt that they had enough storage going forward? Strange. It seems to me they are perennial questions in some sense too, aren't they? Who's next? Sharon, do you want to?
Thank you. Right, I'm Simon Parker from the UK Data Service. One thing I was interested about in the presentation was you mentioned about data which will require certain licensing agreements, such as, we have secure access data. So how would that fit into the platform that you're suggesting? How would the data be accessed? How would the confidentiality be protected?
Are you talking about the research data shared service or more generally?
In the data shared service, is it?
Oh. Yeah.
We are building privacy in at source. So not only encryption in transit, not only encryption at rest, although that's further up the development path, but there are also a fairly granular list of licenses options, and when I go through a demo later on, you'll be able to see some of those. So essentially, you tell us what you want, and we make it happen.
Right. Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'll see your presentation.
I'll let Sharon Neil's got a question. Can I, before Neil tees up though, just as you're teeing up, that's the one that struck me actually, the distributed nature. So some of you know I'm an archaeologist by training, and archaeology has always been a very distributed research discipline, people in the field. I mean, that's why I got a nice warm, dry job indoors, frankly. And the consequence though, so 10 years ago there was distributed technology for research, in archaeological fieldwork. But 10 years ago the regulatory environment we operated in was really different and really simpler, and I wonder almost it's not the technology that's creating the challenge there, almost it's the changing and the more draconian kind of legal and regulatory environment that's really striking to me. Anyway, that was just an intermission while Neil got his microphone.
Neil Beagrie, Charles Beagrie Limited. I don't know if this is a set of questions really for you, Chris, or for Paul. I was just interested in an update on the Progress Research Data Service sort of launch, when you think the service may go live, and also when sort of details of the pricing would be available.
Right. We are transitioning to service end quarter 3, beginning quarter 4. Pricing, we've just had a radical change in the way certain things get together, so we're changing our business model and modelling as a result. I would like to see a pricing model by the end of June. It really depends on myself, on colleagues, and as to how much of that can be published and when that can be published. But as soon as possible. I mean, we as you rightly point out, we need that as soon as possible.
And the service itself is launched in the autumn, isn't it, Paul? Yeah.